Good evening, and once again, welcome. This lesson is being recorded for Sunday, March the 8th, 2026. This is the lesson that will be presented when we gather together here in Bellflower, California at the Rose Avenue Church of Christ at 6 o'clock in the evening. And as is always the case, if you are in our area, we do invite you to come and be with us as we gather together to worship God and to study His Word throughout the week. Every Sunday we have a Bible study at 9:45. Our morning worship service is at 10:50. Our evening worship service is at 6. And on Wednesday night we have another Bible study at 7:30. And you're welcome to come be with us every time that we gather together. As we do so, it is that we seek to worship God according to the pattern that we have described in His Word. And as we study His Word, we seek to do so making proper application of His Word. I'm sharing the lessons that I am pre-recording before our actual assemblies with the hope that you find some benefit from these things if you are not in our area. But we do hope that if you are in our area, you will come and visit with us sometime. We would be honored by your presence. Let's go ahead and get started with the lesson that we have for this evening. We are continuing our journey through the Bible, something that we started a little over 4 years ago, which is a study of the 17 time periods of Bible history. Currently, we are dealing with the United Kingdom, the 9th of those 17 Bible periods. And today we want to talk about David, Goliath, and Jonathan as recorded in chapters 17 through 20. And in this particular time period, known as the United Kingdom, it is a period of time that lasted about 120 years. 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, each who reigned for about 40 years apiece. And it was a period, while there was definitely conflict, especially during the life of King Saul, it would eventually reach a point in the life of David and then Solomon where Israel enjoyed relative peace, and they expanded as far as they would, as far as their dominance within that particular region. It's recorded beginning in 1 Samuel 8, and it goes through 1 Kings 11, which means all of 2 Samuel, and also 1 Chronicles and the first few chapters of 2 Chronicles, which actually deals with the life of Solomon and so on. You also have much of the poetic literature that is introduced during this period of time. Now, in our last lesson, in which we dealt with, we're in 1 Samuel, and we dealt with 1 Samuel chapters 15 and 16, which is where we find that Saul failed to destroy the Amalekites as God had told him to do. And as a result of that, God, in His eyes, rejected Saul from being king. And then, of course, in chapter 16, we know that Samuel is sent to David to anoint him as the next king. And, of course, we know that David is the youngest of the sons of Jesse. And after all the others are passed by, David is the one that is appointed a man after God's own heart. But it's interesting because David enters into the life of King Saul. As a matter of fact, there's this distressing spirit that we were introduced to in our last lesson. And David was able to soothe him, at least early on, with playing harp music for him. And so David became important to Saul. And of course, we're going to continue to develop that as we go into our lesson today, which is beginning with chapter 17. And in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we have one of the best known stories or accounts dealing with the life of David. And of course, what we're talking about here is we are talking about David and Goliath. And that's what 1 Samuel chapter 17 is about. What we find in this text is the Philistines, they've gathered together in battle against Israel near Soko, which is in Judah. And the important thing to understand here is the Philistines continue to encroach into what is the nation of Israel. And they continue to be a thorn in the side during the entire time that King Saul is alive, and even during parts of the life of David, even though David gains greater control over them as he establishes himself as king. But we'll get into that a little bit later on this year when we get into his life and so on. But we find that this is the occasion where they gather together against Israel. And of course, we hear about Goliath, who actually was very, very tall. According to the descriptions, he was over 9 feet tall. And he was this great warrior who would go out into the midst of this field, and he would mock Israel, and he would challenge Israel. He said, you know what, rather than us fighting and everybody killing each other, you send out your best warrior, and we'll fight each other, and whoever wins, the other side will surrender. And of course, there's nobody in Israel who's willing to confront him. And bear in mind that the army of Israel is on one side of this valley, the army of the Philistines on the other. And so you have all the valiant warriors of Israel, and none of them are willing to face up to Goliath. But then we're introduced to David in this particular account. Jesse speaks to David, who is at home tending to the sheep, and he gives him supplies to go and inquire about his 3 older brothers who are at the battle site, and they're soldiers in the army, and he wants to know how they're doing. And he also sends supplies to bring to them as well as to the troops of Israel. And I suspect that that's how troops during war were actually supported back during that time, and I guess that's true when you go throughout history as well. But anyways, David goes there, and when he goes there, he hears Goliath mocking the people of Israel and issuing this challenge every morning and every day. And it says he did it for 40 days. And he inquires about Goliath, what's going on, and what happens to the one who slays Goliath. And some of the promises were he would be related to the king. He would be given his daughter, one of the king's daughters. Also, the family would be exempt of taxes and various things like that. But of course, David, not so much interested in those things. He's concerned because nobody will stand up to this uncircumcised Philistine who is, as David described it, defying the armies of the living God. And of course, Eliab, the oldest brother of David, hears about this, and he rebukes David. He basically thinks that the only reason David is there is because he wants to see what is going on, and thus he's getting in the way. But David replies in verse number 29 of chapter 17, "What have I done? Is there not a cause?" And basically in that statement, what David is saying is, I'm willing to fight. Somebody needs to face up to this man. And if nobody else will, I'm willing to do that. And that's basically what David is offering to do. And of course, Saul is told about this. And so David goes and he meets with Saul. And of course, Saul tells him, you're too young. You're only a youth, and this man is a great warrior. There's no way that you can stand up to him. But David doesn't care about that. David basically tells Saul that, I'm able to do what I need to do. He said, I have fought against a bear and I have fought against a lion, and I've killed both of those when they were a threat to the flock. And he says, and this uncircumcised Philistine, God will deliver him to me too. God's on my side is basically the attitude that David has, and that's what gets him through this thing. So Saul consents and basically says, you can go fight against him, but he tries to arm him. He gives him his own armor. And bear in mind, you may recall that Saul is a tall individual, taller than anybody else, which means very likely that armor was too big for David. David tries it on, and it's heavy and it's too big, and so he takes it off and says, I don't need this. Furthermore, I haven't tested it. And the idea of testing it is getting used to this. I mean, you don't go out and use a weapon until you know how it works. That's common sense. Anybody who handles weapons, you need to know how to use it. And so I said, I don't need that. And so what David does instead is he goes to a brook that is in the community, or that is in the valley where they're fighting, and he just picks up 5 smooth stones, and then he goes out to confront Goliath with nothing but those stones, a bag, and he has his sling in his hand. And of course, when Goliath sees David coming to him, Goliath, I describe it as he's insulted. You know, he's insulted by, why would you send me this nobody to come fight against me? And he mocks David and Israel. Is this the best you can do? And he basically says, come here and I'm gonna teach you a lesson. I'm gonna feed you to the animals, kind of a thing. But I want you to notice the reply of David in verses 45 and 46 of chapter 17, where David says to him, you come here with a sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver me into your hand. I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, but the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So David makes this bold declaration to Saul. And of course, we know what happens. David charges toward Goliath, and he takes 1 stone and puts it in his sling, and he strikes Goliath, and he falls to the ground dead. Then David takes Goliath's sword, which is big and heavy, and he cuts off Goliath's head. And as a result of that, the Philistines flee. Israel is emboldened on this occasion because somebody has stood up to the Philistines, and they are successful in driving back the Philistines basically into their own territory. The term that is used is they're driven all the way back to Ekron. And of course, after they drive them out, the Israelites, they return and they plunder the tents of the Philistines, which was typical of wartime back then. David takes Goliath's head home to Jerusalem, and he puts the armor of Goliath in his tent. And then we find that the head of Goliath is actually presented to King Saul. And of course, Saul inquires of Abner, who is his general, about who David is. And of course, he learns that he is the son of Jesse and so on. And very likely the intent of Saul is to reward David at this particular time. And we know that David is going to be close to Saul during all of this time. Remember, he's already soothed him when he has the distressing spirit. And we're going to see more of that as we get into chapter 18. Now, in chapter 18, we find here that David continues to be successful in battles. Saul makes David one of his generals, and he begins to lead the people, and he obviously becomes a great warrior in all of these things. But what we do read in verses 1 through 4, that Jonathan and David, it says their souls were knit together, and Jonathan loved David as his own soul. And I want you to understand that they have this very, very close friendship with each other. And all I'm going to say right now is this is platonic, and I just want to leave it at that. There are other lessons that we could address. That this is a platonic relationship. In other words, they're just extremely close friends. They're so close that Jonathan makes this covenant with David, which is one of the things you read there in these verses, in verse 3. And Jonathan gives David his robe, his armor, and his sword. And basically, he gives David what he needs so that David can engage in battle and so on. So all of that takes place on this occasion. And of course, David is very successful. So David goes out and he confronts the Philistines, and he behaves wisely in whatever he is doing. And Israel's successful because of David, and the people love David. And even Saul is pleased with David until one day when The people are rejoicing because of their victories over the Philistines. And in verse number 7, it says of chapter 18 that the women sang as they danced, Saul has slain his 1,000. Okay, great. And David his 10,000s. And when Saul heard that praise, it says, Saul became angry, and he was upset from that day forward. And so he determined, because of all this, that it was time to kill David. And he sets out basically to remove David from his life. Matter of fact, you read in verse number 15 of the text there, it says there, when Saul saw that David behaved wisely, he was afraid of him. And it's actually said that 2 or 3 times as you go through this text. You also read on this occasion, after Saul becomes jealous of David and envious of David, you find that he has this distressing spirit, and while David's trying to soothe him with music, Saul takes his spear and he tries to pin David to the wall with the spear, and of course David flees. He has to flee from him. But Saul is afraid of David, and we're going to see why as we continue to develop throughout this lesson. Well, following that, as you continue in chapter 18, remember the promise was made that the one who killed Goliath would become a son to the king. One of his daughters would be given to him. And so here you find Saul, and it says in verse 17 that he offers his oldest daughter Merab to him, or an older daughter Merab to him. And what he was hoping was that David would die in battle, looking for a suitable dowry. But David humbly refuses to marry her. Basically says, I'm not royalty. I'm not worthy to be called the king's son. And that demonstrates something about his attitude. And as a result of that, you read that Saul gives Merab to somebody else to marry. But then you also read that Saul's younger daughter, named Michal, actually loves David. And when Saul is told about this, it makes Saul happy, and he again wants to convince David to marry his daughter, and David is hesitant again, but the servants of David, or the servants of Saul, convince David to marry her. And basically David says, I don't have anything to give the king, but the king says, all I'll ask from you is 100 foreskins of the Philistines. In other words, you go out and engage in battle, and you kill 100 Philistines and so on, and I'll accept that as dowry. And of course, David, he and his men, they go out and they kill 200. And so he doubles it, which says something about David, and his loyalty. And he looks forward to marrying Michal, is what I see on this particular occasion. So Saul gives Michal to David, but you continue to read in the text that Saul is fearful of David because of everything that is happening in this text. Well, you go on, and that brings us to chapter 19, which is where we find the persecution of David continues, or it actually grows even stronger. You have an occasion where he's cast a spear at David and David's head, and he escapes as a result of that. But now we find that he actually wants to kill David, and he actually tells Jonathan, and he tells some of his other servants in chapter 19, I want you to kill David. But Jonathan knows who David is, and he intercedes on David's behalf at first, and he reminds his father everything that David had done, and how David had been loyal, and how David had killed Goliath, and those types of things. And as a result of this, Saul relents from wanting to have David killed and actually restores him. And of course, this is going to be very temporary, as we're going to see here in a very few moments here. Then we continue to read about wars in verses 8 through 10. And you find that once again, Saul again has this distressing spirit from the Lord. And David is playing his harp, trying to soothe him. And once again, Saul throws a spear at him, trying to pin him to the wall and to kill him. But again, David flees from him on this occasion. And he returns to Michal's house. And Michal knows what is going on, that there's an attempt by Saul to get rid of David. And so Saul, or Michal, helps David escape through a window, lowers him through a window. And we find that he does escape from the people, and then she disguises the bed, puts something that looks like David in the bed. And when the soldiers come to take David and so on, they discover that David's not there. So Saul asks Michal, why have you done this? And Michal says, and this is a lie, that he threatened to kill me if I didn't let him go. And I don't know why she would say something like that, but she does. It causes a problem. Just remember that. When she makes that lie, it actually causes a problem where that is concerned. But then we find that David goes and he finds Samuel in a place called Ramah. And from there they leave Ramah together and they go to Naioth. And Saul is told that David is at Naioth. So he sends servants, messengers, likely to get David and to bring him back to Saul. And of course Saul wants to execute him. Well, anyways, the messengers, they arrive, and there's a group of prophets. Samuel is there, and there are prophets that are prophesying. And rather than being able to take David into custody, this group of prophets begins to prophesy. And I don't know what all is involved in that, but they begin to prophesy. So a second group is sent, and they too begin to prophesy. Then a third group is sent. And finally, Saul himself goes. And while Saul is there, even he begins to prophesy. And it says he strips off his clothes, you might say his outer garments, and he is prophesying to God. And the point of all this, and I don't fully understand everything of as this takes place, but basically God's defeating his plan. And what God is declaring is, you're not going to stop me from accomplishing what I intend to accomplish. So that's what takes place. And of course that brings us to chapter 20, where David again has to flee from Saul. And you might say that this is once and for all, basically. So what happens in chapter 20 is, again, you have David coming to Jonathan, and he asks Jonathan, what have I done? Why is your father against me? What is my iniquity, or what is my sin against your father? And Jonathan promises to protect David. He says, I will defend you. I will see what I can do to get this resolved. And of course, what you read in chapter 20 is chapter 20 is this plan that is devised to determine whether or not it would be safe for David to return to the presence of Saul. And basically, what it amounted to is David was going to go to Bethlehem. At least this is what Saul's going to be told, is David was going to go to Bethlehem to offer a sacrifice along with his family, and thus he would be absent from the table. And then Jonathan, who is an archer, he's a soldier, and he's going to go out to practice and take a youth with him. And depending on what he says as he shoots the arrow, as the youth goes to fetch the arrow, would determine whether or not it was safe for David to come. Long story short, when I shoot the arrow, if I tell the youth it's it's in front of you, then it's okay. But if it's beyond where you are and he sends you further, then it's not okay. And of course, after this, David is waiting for about 3 days in hiding, waiting to hear what's going to happen. Dinner time comes. David's supposed to be there. He's not. The first day, Saul says, oh, maybe he's unclean. He'll be here tomorrow. The second day, he's not there. And Saul asks Jonathan, why is he not here? And Jonathan actually says he's not here because he's gone to offer this sacrifice. And I want you to note in verses 30 and 31 of this chapter. And incidentally, I have marked down on the slide verses 13 through 16, and I want you to just go read that sometime. And what you find in that text is Jonathan knows that David's going to be the next king. And he's basically telling him, when you are king, remember me. Show kindness to me and my household. And that's a part of the covenant. In verses 30 and 31, when Jonathan explains that David is not there, that he's going to offer the sacrifices, this is the response of Saul. In verse 30, he says, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." And so what you have here, and the point of this verse, Saul knows that David is the one that God has chosen. So Saul knows David's going to be the next king. And that's why he says, and he tells Jonathan, do you realize as long as he's alive, you're not going to be the next king? And of course, Jonathan defends David. He continues to defend David to the point that Saul takes his sword and throws it at David at Jonathan, so that Jonathan has to escape. Well, of course, as a result of this, Jonathan goes out and he's shooting his arrows and he sends the message, and the message to David is, you can't come back. It's not safe. It's not safe. So as a result of that, following this, the young lad who is fetching the arrow returns, and it says in the latter part of chapter 20 that David meets with Jonathan, and basically they say goodbye to one another, and it says that they kiss. And I want you to understand, again, this is platonic, this is friendship, and this is the way they greeted each other back in that culture, and they weep. Jonathan knows he's not going to spend much time with David in the future there because of what is going on. And David is sent away in peace, and Jonathan returns to his father. So that is the text that we've been talking about. Now, as I've done with all of these lessons, let's make some applications. And I'll tell you right now, there is a lot of lessons that we can learn from this particular text. You go through the Old Testament, Romans 15:4. Whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of Scripture might have hope. We can learn from God's Word, and there's so many good lessons that we could apply. So let's just think about a few of these lessons. Number one, with God's help, you can face the giants in your life. And of course, this is playing off of David facing Goliath, David facing the giant. And oftentimes when we make expression, there's giants in our lives, it's making reference to this confrontation here. And of course, the point is if God's on your side, God can help you overcome. You go back to 1 Samuel 16. This is when Samuel is sent to anoint a son of Jesse, and all the other sons have passed by and they were not it. You read there, the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at the appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. God looks differently. Over in Romans chapter 8 and verse 31, Paul says, if God be for us, who can be against us? You want to be on God's side because God is able to take down giants. And I think that's a lesson that we ought to give consideration to. And God's ways are not the ways of man. Another lesson I think we can learn from David is building from past experience. And what I simply mean by this is, David is already a brave individual. I mean, the fact that he went out and confronted a bear and a lion, and he was able to kill both of them, that would be powerful animals. He was able to defeat them. And so when he's ready to face Goliath, he knows, number one, God is with me, and I'm not afraid of him. Somebody needs to deal with this, this uncircumcised Philistine, if you will. And what I see in this is David has confidence, and he knows that he's capable. He's looked at what he's done in the past, and he knows what his abilities are. And that's just simply the point that I'm making as I make this observation. We can learn from our past. You know, there's many passages like Job 12:12, which says, wisdom is with aged men, and with length of days understanding. Now, I know this is talking about old age and so on, but it says wisdom is with aged men. In other words, older people that are wise, they're wise because they've learned from their past. And they're better off because of that. Proverbs 3:13, similar. Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding. That's what we need in our lives. Over in Psalm 37:25, this is David. Later on in his life, he will say, I have been young and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread. And basically what he's saying, I can look back. I can look back, and with what I've seen in the past, I know that I can trust God. That's his experience. And you see that as he's willing to confront Goliath. And remember, Saul said to David, you're a youth, and he's a great warrior. And David said, I don't care. That's not what this is about. This is about trusting God. And he had experience with that. Furthermore, David is one who gives God the credit. And you find this all throughout this study. You know, our journey through the Bible, God is given credit in all of these things, and that is the point. And the point is David's not, his confidence is not in himself, but what God is able to accomplish and who God is. You see, David was one who always glorified God. When you read through many of the Psalms, David is glorifying God. Psalm 23:1, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's about bringing glory to him. And you find that as a consistent theme throughout the Psalms. Over in James 1 and verse 17, James tells us every good and perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights. Good things come from God, and I'm going to give God the glory. Over in 1 Peter 4 and verse 11, 1 Peter 4 and verse number 11, this is a passage where Peter is telling us that in whatever you do, it should bring glory to God. He says there, if anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it as with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. God deserves the glory in all things and at all times. Let's glorify God. Give God credit, the credit that he deserves so often. Another lesson that we can learn, you got that expression, is there not a cause? You know, David sees nobody's willing to stand up against Goliath. And David asks, isn't there a cause behind this? Don't you think that God wants you to go defeat this giant? And so that's the point. Well, we have a cause. We need to live knowing there is a cause for what we do. Our cause is to get to heaven when this life is over. Our cause is to live a pure life and fight the good fight of faith. Our cause is to go out and reach others. Is there not a cause behind the Christian life that we live? Another lesson that we can learn is how God can use those who are young. One of the things that Saul told David is, you're just a youth. You're just a young person. Yeah, that's true. He was young, compared to others. And I don't know exactly how young. He might have been in his 20s or whatever, still young. But the point I want you to understand, he said, that doesn't mean God can't use me. And in the Bible, there's many examples of young people that God used. You have Joseph, of course, who was relatively young as he was sold into slavery, and we know what he ended up doing. You have a servant girl in Naaman's house who sends Naaman, a leper, to Elisha, who helps him cure his leprosy. Timothy, in 1 Timothy 4:12, let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers in everything that you do. Live your life so that older people won't despise you and look down on you. And then you have a boy with a small lunch. 5 loaves and 2 fish. 5,000 men are fed as a result of that on that particular occasion there. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse number 1 says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. So think about God and understand that even if you're young, it doesn't mean you can't do anything. Matter of fact, there's a lot that can be accomplished regardless of who you are in life. God can use those who are young, and sometimes we who are older need to remember that as we make decisions. Another lesson that we definitely can learn from this text is pride goes before a fall. We certainly see the arrogance of Saul in this whole situation here. When Saul's happy with David until he hears a lady saying, oh, Saul, he's been successful. He's defeated thousands, but David's defeated 10,000. And Saul becomes jealous. He's prideful. He's very prideful in what he is doing here. Psalm 16 and verse 5 tells us, everyone proud of heart is an abomination to the Lord. Verse 18 of Proverbs 16, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. And of course, James 4:6, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. We must never forget those things. Another lesson that we can learn is to think about the mighty armor of God. David cast off the armor of Saul. He didn't need it. He didn't want it. It didn't fit. It had not been tested. He wanted the armor of God with him. He just needed God on his side. That's all he needed. We need the armor of God. We are not going to win our spiritual battles with conventional weapons. We need to put on the armor of God. Paul was very clear in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse number 3 that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty in God for casting down strongholds. And of course, talking about spiritual strongholds and everything that exalts himself against Christ. You read about our armor in Ephesians chapter 6 verses 10 through 18. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in the heavenly places. Therefore, you put on the whole armor of God. And that armor is described, and it's not swords and spirits, but it's not swords and spears and those types of things, but rather it's righteousness and faith and the gospel of peace and hope and those types of qualities in our life. That's what we use with our battles. Another lesson that we can learn from our text is the value of a close, trusted friend. And that's one of the things you get from the relationship between David and Jonathan. David has a friend that he can confide in with everything. They trust each other, they love each other and care about each other. As friends, it's platonic, but they care about each other, and so they're standing with each other, and this is that one that you can go to and you can tell them anything, and you know that they care about you and they're not going to betray you, and they're going to help you in whatever way that they can. We all need a friend like that. We need a friend like that. Sometimes it's your spouse, and your spouse ought to be that, at least to a degree. But then you have others. Maybe you have another friend who you're just so close to that you can open up to them. And if you've got a problem, you can go to them. And they love you, and they're going to help you deal with that problem. They're not going to betray you with everything else. We read in Proverbs chapter 18 and in verse number 24 that there is a friend that sticks closer than a brother. And a friend is made for adversity. Proverbs 17 and verse 17. Or a brother is there for adversity. A friend is there at all times. And that's what, we all need that. And that's what David and Jonathan had in their relationship with each other. Another lesson we can learn, in addition to being envious, as Saul was, or prideful, he was also jealous. And this is another a great enemy of Saul. This is a part of his undoing. I'm convinced this is a part of his distressing spirit. And just as the Bible condemns envy, and just as the Bible condemns pride, the Bible also condemns jealousy. It is a fruit of it is a work of the flesh. In Galatians 5:19 through 21, those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Another lesson that we can learn from this is about the problem with ungodly scheming. You know, Solomon was scheming against David. Once he became jealous and envious of David, he wanted to get rid of David, and he tried to find ways to do that. You know, tried to give him, give him his daughter, hoping that he would fall in battle. It didn't work, but he was scheming. You know, it's sad that Saul is not the only one who has schemed against the godly. And you can look at other examples in Scripture of that. But, you know, when we live in a society where there are many who stand opposed to those who are trying to do what's right where God is concerned. And there's a sense in which that doesn't surprise us. We expect those of the world to scheme against the godly. But what hurts the most is when it's someone who professes to be your friend. When somebody who's supposed to be a brother, maybe it's a brother in Christ, and you find that they're scheming against you. Friends, that's a problem. And that's kind of the situation you have with Saul. David was loyal to Saul. We know that. But Saul, with his flaws, despised David as a result of it. Another lesson to consider in this is, are you willing to stand up for the righteous? Are you willing to stand up for the vulnerable and the weak? Jonathan stood up for David. And that's a point we must never forget as we give consideration to that. Over in Psalm 31, verses 8 and 9, you read there, open your mouth for the speechless, in the cause of all who are appointed to die. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and the needy. We need to stand up for those who are doing the right thing, and those who are vulnerable. We need to stand up for them. Are you willing to stand up for somebody who's saying the right thing, even if it's the unpopular thing? 1 Thessalonians 5:14, you uphold the weak and you're patient with all. So we need to stand up for those who are doing that which is right. I think another lesson we can learn from this is always try reasoning first when you're in a tense situation. Before you actually engage in battle with somebody, try to reason. Use wisdom and try to diffuse the situation. Again, that's what Jonathan did. And it was actually successful at least once or twice, where he's pleading with Saul. David's been loyal to you. He took down the giant. He's done nothing but stand with you. Why are you doing this to him? And it worked the first time. Another lesson that we might learn is to realize that God can accomplish his purpose. And I'm going to turn now. We've seen that all throughout these studies of going through the various time periods of Bible history. God's purpose is being accomplished. And that's really the theme of this entire study, if you will. Again, in Romans chapter 8 and verse number 31, if God be for us, who can be against us? Paul in Philippians 14, Philippians 4:13, I can do all through Christ who strengthens me. What a true statement that is. Another lesson that we can learn here is the importance of covenants. David and Jonathan made a covenant with each other. They took an oath that they were going to defend each other and be there for each other no matter what happened. And I'm going to tell you now, in our lives, we make covenants. Now we need to be cautious and not make too many of them and not make them in the wrong places. But you know, when you obey the gospel, you're making a covenant with God. You're making a covenant with Jesus to serve him. When you get married, you are entering into a covenant with your spouse, that is going to be the one that you intend to live with for the rest of your lives together. And that is the bottom line. And so there we have several lessons that are associated with this particular with this particular text that we've gone over. One final observation here, and this is interesting. In Psalm 59, you have here a psalm that is actually keyed to our particular text in Psalm 19. You read there, we go over to Psalm 59, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, we don't have time. But there's a handful of psalms that are actually keyed to specific events, primarily in the life of David. And you read in these superscriptions, and I'm not sure whether we can say the superscriptions are inspired or not, but I believe they're historically accurate. They're very old. And you read here, it says, it is a Michtam of David when Saul sent men and they watched the house in order to kill him. Very likely that's dealing with when David was supposedly in Michal's house. Michal has already helped him escape. But this is a psalm where David is praising God for delivering him and praising his greatness, but also he's requesting that God defeat his enemies and overcome his enemies. That's what you find in this particular psalm. And then the final lesson that we would apply in all of this is, will you accept your place before God? When it comes to Jonathan, as I said, I believe in this text we learn here that Jonathan knew that David was the one that God had chosen. Jonathan knew that he was not going to be the next king, and quite honestly, Jonathan accepted that. He was satisfied to let God make the decisions. And that's really the point that we want to give consideration to as we think about this. We all in our lives, and I know this is something I've preached on, is we have limitations. Just because of who we are, you may not be authorized to do something. You may not be authorized to take a particular role where the church is concerned. Or maybe you just don't have the ability to do something. There's those who are better and more capable at certain actions, whether it be leading in worship or something else like that. Be humble enough to accept whatever your limitations are, because we all have them. And the question is, are we willing to accept them? And are we willing to accept our place where God intends for that place to be? So there we have another lesson taken from our journey through the Bible. We're all going to face circumstances in this life. The question is, how will you handle whatever challenges come your way? I think we see that in this lesson and many others. So with that in mind, once again, I want to thank you for listening to this lesson, and I hope that you have found some benefit in what has been said in this lesson. It gives you something to apply as you go through this day and through the rest of this week. And may God be with you as you strive to be with God in everything that you do. So thank you for listening, and until next time, have a good day and goodbye.